Welcome to the Filmlings Podcast,
a bi-weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 60, Wild Westerns.
Yeah, the big 60. Man, our podcast would not quite be able to retire with Social Security benefits.
No, but this episode has been a long time coming. We've been talking about Westerns off and on the podcast, through Kurosawa and stuff like that. And so it was time that we took a deep dive and just looked at how Western films have evolved throughout film history. And I think we have got a good set of films to do that with. So Alex, why don't you tell us what films we'll be talking about?
Yeah, we've got an epic set of films and an epic set of directors to go along with those films. The first one we're going to talk about is Stagecoach from 1939, directed by who else but John Ford. And it won Best Score, Best Actor in a Supporting Role at the Oscars. But I think the fact that it was directed by John Ford and was probably the first big John Wayne starring role in a Western is maybe more important than those Oscar wins, and we'll talk about that more here in a bit. But it is based on a short story called The Stage to Lordsburg by Ernest Haycox, and Stagecoach definitely rolls off the tongue better, so I'm really glad they renamed it.
Right. And second, we're going to be looking at The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly from 1966, directed by Sergio Leone. I feel like we've been dancing around this one because we did A Fistful of Dollars, which is kind of in the same, quote-unquote trilogy, and we did The Good, the Bad, the Weird, but we finally got to this one, which is a movie that I personally love. And it's kind of the flagship spaghetti Western. We'll talk about that a little bit, coming from Sergio Leone, an Italian director. As we've kind of mentioned before, there was just a big time when there was a lot of Italian directors making Westerns in Italy, and that became known as spaghetti Westerns. So we get to see, what that's all about today.
Yeah, and our final film for the day is Django Unchained, from very recent, 2012, one of our few 20-teens movies that we've done on the podcast, and it was directed by Quentin Tarantino, as we all know, and it won for Best Original Screenplay and Best Supporting Actor at the Oscars. And the basis for this movie originated while Tarantino was developing a book on Sergio Corbucci's spaghetti Western, Django from 1966.
Yeah, so that is going to be a look at some of these other genres that we'll be looking at with our first two films. All right, so let's get into it. Let's start with Stagecoach from 1939. This is the film that basically propelled Westerns into stardom, basically. This kicked off a long period of time in which Westerns were highly revered, and there were just so many really good Westerns like High Noon and The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. There's just too many to name. There was definitely a period of time in early film history where people just loved Westerns, and that was all kicked off basically by this film. And of course, John Wayne was kicked off by this film. But the plot of the story is there are a group of people who are trying to get from one town to another one, basically. This is just really high-level overview. And they're all thrown into this stagecoach, and they have to drive through Apache country. So it's very dangerous, but they all have very good reasons for wanting to get out of the town that they're in. And so we get to see a lot of these character interactions. So some of the characters that we're introduced to on this journey are John Wayne. We'll start with him. He is obviously one of the biggest players in this. And he plays a character called Ringo Kid. He is your cowboy. He's the rough, tough guy. He recently got out of prison, is still wanted. And he kind of hops into the stagecoach and goes along with them for the ride, with one of the greatest introduction shots in all of film history. Just an amazing rack focus And then we also have a woman named Dallas, and her character is never explicitly defined, but it is heavily implied
She's
that
a prostitute.
she is. Yes, she is a woman of the night.
Always here with the spoilers, folks.
So you definitely see that. You basically are told that through the reaction that all the other characters around her
The
have
snooty,
to her.
uppity church community, or social standing community or something like that, that turns their noses up at her.
Yeah, because we also have the doctor, Dr. Josiah Boone, who is a drunk, and he is he's more sympathetic to her. And at the beginning of the film, they kind of get into the carriage together, and he says, we are among a class of society known as what does he say, like social outcasts or pariahs or something like that. So he kind of has a connection with her. But we have another woman, Mrs. Lucy Mallory. She's married to a general in the army, and she is hoping to catch up with him on this stagecoach ride. But yeah, she is very much part of that pristine class who will have nothing to do with such an impure woman as Dallas. And she catches the eye of Hatfield, who is a Southern gentleman. And we kind of deconstruct that entire definition and a lot of social boundaries throughout this film. But he's always kind of trying to look out for Miss Mallory and keep her away from the risque Dallas, who does nothing risque within this film. It's all like just heavily implied, and you can see that she's kind of ashamed of herself because of the way that everyone else is acting towards her, except for John Wayne, who comes into this stagecoach a little bit later and doesn't know all of these everyone's social standings right off the bat. And so when he sees Hatfield giving water to Miss Mallory, or getting her a seat at the table and stuff like that, he's like, well, what about the other lady? And he's kind of being very gentlemanly towards Dallas.
Plus, John Wayne is an outlaw who's just been released from jail.
Yeah, so he's
kind of an outcast too.
Yeah, and there's a great scene, probably my favorite scene in the whole film, when they are sitting down for dinner, and Hatfield basically moves Mrs. Lucy to a different seat away from Dallas after John Wayne has just found her a seat, and John Wayne thinks that they're moving away from him, and he says, "Oh man, I must have the plague or something. You get out of jail and no one wants to be near you." And Dallas is like, no, it's not you. So I mean, they've got that connection going on just on that level. And so throughout the film, it's taking these archetypes, these stereotypes of different people and their reactions to other people, because and then breaking them down and bringing them together, or not in the case of Hatfield, as we see that he is very cowardly, and then we learn that Dallas is very loving and nurturing as she helps Miss Lucy with a baby that she ends up delivering on the journey. So there's a lot of dynamics, and it's just a really great character study, almost akin to like Lifeboat, like we talked about with Alfred Hitchcock, where you just have a bunch of characters thrown together in this one little conveyance. And it's not exactly what we call a bottle movie, because they get out and they go to different locations and stuff like that. But it kind of is in the fact that we stick with these same 5 or 6 characters throughout, and just see each of their character arcs through the journey.
Yeah. And in terms of, what we're doing today, like looking at Westerns on a large scale scope and tracking them over the course of generations, different movie makers, different movie goers, then this is a nice movie to look at just for the concept of Western archetypes in general, because they're so clearly defined. I mean, it's literally a rogues gallery. It's like pulling I think you were saying, Jonathan, it was like you're playing Clue with just very clearly defined characters, like they're almost color coded, like the drunk, the lady of the night. How many euphemisms of that can we use?
How many did John Ford use? He didn't have to use any. He just
woman,
didn't say it.
The gentleman, the outlaw, the sheriff, so on and so forth.
Which, and you have the driver and the guy who rides shotgun. I'm not exactly sure what his position was, but they're kind of thrown into the mix without any, like, they don't necessarily take sides in any of this, but they add a fun flavor to it.
Yeah. I mean, the characters are so well defined, and the conflict is simple, maybe a bit controversial, but simple, straightforward, and it makes it kind of a very just well laid out movie that, with the follow through that a director like John Ford has, with just excellent cinematography and knowing where to put the camera when on which character, makes it for a very well constructed movie that's stood the test of time. It's still considered a classic today.
Yeah, absolutely. And this set a precedent for Westerns, like we've been saying. It set a precedent for John Ford as far as, using John Wayne. First of all, John Wayne is himself just a pillar of the Western genre. But also, this is the first film that John Ford made set in Monument Valley in, Arizona, Utah, with all of the huge rock sculptures and all of that, which just sets this really nice landscape and backdrop that we get to watch unfold throughout this really long journey by Stagecoach across the West.
Yeah. And again, this is a nice way to look at the classical Hollywood, the Golden Age Hollywood depiction of the West, what the West is. The West is full of all of these characters. It's full of outlaws with hearts of gold and heroic sheriffs trying to do the right thing, and all these other confused characters with shades of gray in between.
We get a good showdown at the end.
Yeah. These heroic shoot 'em ups. And the towns are small, but in this version of the West, they're not necessarily, dirty or run down, like we'll see when we get to something that's a little more pulpy, when we get to the Westerns of the 60s and 70s. Everything's still kind of crisp and clean, and it's just
because it's a romanticized West.
Yeah, exactly.
A lot of these early Westerns were this kind of romanticized version of the West, where you have your hero, John Wayne, may be rough around the edges, but he's still like the role model and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, everything functions as a myth. Everything is turned into a fable, where you have your heroes and your villains, and it's very clear cut. And that's pretty typical of Westerns of this period. And it's very typical of John Ford's work as well, for now. Later, once you get into some of his later work, like The Searchers, or some of his later work where he starts to take a step back and show Indians or Native Americans in a much better light than he does in this movie, then that's when kind of the Golden Age directors and Golden Age Hollywood started to change how the West was depicted. It became less romanticized. But at this point in time, when we're talking about Stagecoach, it definitely is a romanticized version. And, with the fable epic storytelling that was popular on the silver screen at the time, and it was incredibly popular. It was very easy to shoot a Western. They remained, almost a little generic at times, unless you threw them to a really good director like John Ford or Howard Hawks. But they were very popular, generally fairly well made, and very, very typical of the Golden Age of Hollywood.
Yeah, and speaking of portrayal of Native Americans, that's one of the kind of controversial aspects of this film, because basically the Native Americans are just there to be the bad guys. They're just there to be this kind of wild group of people that just exist to attack the white people in the Stagecoach. So regardless of how this film is still very well beloved and all that, but we have to take a lot of films from different areas with a grain of salt, and we've talked about that a lot before. But yeah.
And the flaws in the cultural depiction of Native Americans doesn't invalidate the excellent craftsmanship or the excellent
value
acting
of the film
or the strong structure of the movie, but it is something to consider. And nowadays when we make a Western, for the few people who still try to make Westerns,
right,
then that's something to learn from and keep in mind, and try to portray all of your characters in a complex light. And as we've had extensive discussions on this podcast before, not only is that like a positive social thing to do, but it's just good for your movie in general. We tend to favor very complex storytelling these days with very complex characters. So black and white faceless swarms of bad guys don't work as well as they did in 1939.
So yeah, with all that being said, basically take the good things from the films that you like, but be discerning in what things you keep. Taking lessons from John Ford is not relegated to making Westerns, as we'll see. Even Orson Welles just loved this film. He basically considered it like a textbook for filmmaking, and he said that he watched it like over 40 times when preparing to make Citizen Kane, which has nothing to do with the West. It's just an incredibly well crafted film by an incredibly seasoned film director.
Yeah, and even talking about how this could be applied to other films. If we want to return to a discussion we've had before, and this is a very good example of it, of A plot and B plot interceding. This is a great example because it's got a great A plot that's external and almost MacGuffin-y in the sense that it doesn't matter who's chasing them, it's just that somebody's chasing them, and causing an external threat to this group. But it's got like a billion B plots, and that all of these characters have inter-character conflict that don't really pertain to the Apaches who are threatening them, but are affected by and exasperated by and partially resolved by the fact that they're all being threatened by the Apaches.
So I feel like we're building off of a lot of points that we've talked about before, but as long as we are, let's continue right along and talk about film preservation, because like we've talked about a lot on this podcast, films did not used to be very well stored and maintained before they were really considered of artistic or cultural value. And this film, the original negative, was lost at some point. And John Wayne, though, had a positive reproduction of the film. And so eventually he allowed film preservationists to use that to create a negative. And then that is what all of our all the copies that we see nowadays are from. So again, film preservation is important.
And now everything's backed up digitally a million times. It's so accessible and so preserved that those of us who work in the industry have to. Oh my God, I just said that. I told myself I would never say that, and I said it. Those of us who work in television or film have to sign just oodles and oodles of NDAs to be able to work in it. There's just it's
and
everywhere.
You also have to know that whatever work you do will never go away.
Ever. So, or until the heat death of the universe. So be careful. Be careful out there, but also the work that goes into archiving and restoring and finding and making available lost films and damaged films is really, really important for those of us who care about the history of the industry and the art form that is filmmaking. And also, it always provides a good story to learn about and talk about. We talked about it a billion times on this podcast already. We can give you a short reference list if you wanted, but we probably won't. We're going to go talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Let's do it.
Jonathan, did you know that the title for the good, the bad, and the ugly does not use an Oxford comma?
I did never pay that much attention to it.
I didn't either, and I just noticed it today when we were typing it up for the first time, and it really bugs me. I don't know. I'm a proponent of the Oxford comma, and
Well, if you look at the original title, and I'm going to butcher it. Actually, you could probably say it better than I can because it's Italian. It does have 2 commas in it.
Il buono, il brutto, il cattivo. Il cattivo. Yeah. The good, the ugly, the bad. Yeah. Yeah. That has.
So there you go. There are your commas.
Yeah. You know what? That makes the good, the bad, the weird title make much more sense. They pulled the title straight from the Italian version, not from the American version. Okay. Yeah. So many things explained right now. Look at us. We're learning. That's what we do on this podcast. We learn. So The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly from 1966. Sometimes considered the pinnacle and at very least the big kicking off point for the widespread popularity of spaghetti westerns in American film. I think it might have even been released before A Fistful of Dollars.
Yes, it was released in English after the other 2. You're right.
Yes. So it came to America before the other 2 came to America, which kind of sort of go together. I don't know. We'll talk about that in a second. But The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, the pinnacle of the early part of spaghetti western films, iconic in its depiction of Clint Eastwood with his poncho, which became an American screen image legend, however you want to say it, and whose title has been parodied a billion times and will continue to be parodied a billion times, and for very good reasons. Anyway, this is a much grittier, but at the same time much more over-the-top depiction of the West, and it follows the story of a set of criminals, bounty hunters, and mercenaries. A mercenary named Angel Eyes, played by Lee Van Cleef, a crazy bandit named Tuco, played by Eli Wallach, and finally, and last but not least, Blondie, a bounty hunter played by none other but Clint Eastwood himself. And they are all after the gold that a couple of Confederate soldiers found and then buried somewhere before dying tragically in part of the movie. And they all have different pieces to the puzzle, or get pieces of the puzzle over the course of the film, and they're all after it. The film is set against a background of the Civil War, which is kind of in its wrapping up stages. So it takes place in the West, but not like the super far West. Also, it's, kind of fableized again, not in necessarily a romantic way, but in the let's play around with the facts that history presents kind of way. There wasn't that much fighting out in the desert during the Civil War. It's
more of a general impression of the Civil War than any kind of specific event.
Yeah, like the whole lockdown over a bridge between 2 big armies in the middle of a desert. But it works for the movie, so that's great.
Well, Leone did do his research and tried to be as accurate to the time period as he could within his fictional boundaries.
Yeah, it's about picking and choosing what really matters. As long as it feels real, that's what you want. You don't have to have a textbook open and say that battle never happened there. For the movie to work. As you do
in your Confederate soldier accent.
Is that my Confederate soldier accent? I guess
you tell me.
It could be. We could make it that. Okay, but anyway, they're all after the money. They have a complicated set of relationships with each other. It's implied that they all know Angel Eyes and maybe have worked with him in the past, although I'm not sure they delve into any details about that. But Blondie and Tuco definitely work together. They have a scam in which Blondie allows Tuco to be captured by authorities. The authorities hand the reward money for Tuco, typically in the thousands of dollars, over to Blondie. And then right before Tuco is hanged by the authorities, Blondie will shoot out the rope, letting Tuco escape as everybody runs for cover from the mysterious unseen gunman. And it works.
Really good at shooting hats.
Yeah, it works. They have a falling out though, and break apart early in the movie. Although they do end up working together later on in the movie. And Angel Eyes is a cold-blooded mercenary. The movie opens with
He's
him.
the bad. I guess we didn't describe.
Yeah, I was getting to that. Yeah, I was getting to that. Tuco is the ugly, crazy, in it for himself, a little cutthroat, but not, totally evil and cruel.
Still a little bit lovable.
Blondie is dangerous, but he's technically the good. He doesn't really kill anybody who isn't threatening him directly. And then, of course, we have the bad, who is Angel Eyes, clearly a name given to him, ironically. In fact, the movie opens with him killing one man who, while pleading for his life, tries to hire Angel Eyes to kill the man who hired Angel Eyes to kill the man who's being killed. So just follow that around a certain circles for a minute. And then Angel Eyes goes back and fulfills the contract and kills him. So I guess, if you had to pick an alignment for him, lawful good, like he has a code and he sticks to it. But also, or lawful bad, lawful evil, but he is evil. He is mean. He is despicable. He is, after the money, and he will kill, lie, steal, and cheat to get there. And an excellent and scary performance by Lee Van Cleef. In fact, anytime I see Lee Van Cleef in any other movie, I always go like, oh, there's bad.
Yeah, he's the epitomal Western villain. He even makes an appearance in The Twilight Zone a little bit before this movie comes out. Because I got to throw it out there.
You guys didn't think we'd get through that many episodes without Jonathan making a Twilight Zone reference, did you? Did you? I didn't.
No.
No. But yeah, no, that's the course of the movie. It takes a lot of twists and turns. The setup stays fairly constant throughout the film.
This is a long movie. This is 2 hours and 45 minutes or so. So, I mean, we go on a long journey through the Civil War, basically, both sides of the Civil War.
Yeah, it's almost episodic in the way in the way the movie moves forward. It's like, oh, we're in this town dealing with this thing. Now we're at this battle dealing with this thing. Now we're here, and you'll have a series of scenes in each location, which makes for a very good structure to the film. And yes, it is very interesting having that backdrop of the Civil War, because there's this big conflict that's kind of preoccupying everybody in the movie except for our main characters, who could not give less of a shit about what's going on. They just want the money and they are after it.
Yeah, and that's kind of the whole point. I saw some stuff where basically the way that Sergio Leone thought about this film and the reason he wanted to make this film is it's kind of his way of saying that the Civil War in particular, but war in general, is just kind of dumb and pointless, and you definitely get that sense through it. And we've seen movies that have a similar theme. But his premise, his way of going about this was, I think the phrase he used was, let's make a movie about three bums looking for money throughout the Civil War. And so that's basically what it is. You've got three guys just looking for money while everyone else is fighting for, values or land or whatever. And they're just purely monetarily driven. And yeah, we just kind of get traced through all of these different aspects of the war, and we see everyone from generals to prison guards to just the average soldier laying on the ground dying, and we're taken through this as this big grand backdrop to this really fairly petty primary conflict.
Yeah, and it's definitely a deconstruction of the romantic depiction of the West you saw in the golden era of Hollywood with Stagecoach.
Yeah, because like you've been saying, it's very gruesome.
Yeah, the action's very gritty. The towns get blown apart and ripped apart in the very, very dirty way. There's a lot more crudity to it, and all of the characters are complex. And there are some characters who you'd have to say are either pure evil or next to pure evil.
Yeah.
But even the good characters have a lot of bad in them. It's even hard to look at good and call him a hero. I mean, at the end of the day, he did the least despicable things, but he
It's
also
really a
was
story
just
of
outed.
anti-heroes and villains.
Yeah, he was also just out for money himself. Like, he was also just after money the entire time as well. So even though we root for him throughout the movie, to call him a hero in the same sense that our heroes in Stagecoach were, it's hard to compare the two on the same level. And of course, you might be thinking to yourself, but John Wayne's character was an outlaw in Stagecoach. Well, yeah, but that was more of like his background, and
It was never
his character
explicitly
in the story,
explored.
Yeah, his character in Stagecoach is not a bad guy. He's depicted as having a good heart, but being maybe a confused kid. And even the bad thing he's planning on doing in Stagecoach is honor driven and family driven and has all these redeemable motivations behind it as depicted in the movie. Whereas good and the good, the bad, and the ugly is, again, just after some money.
Right. And so just to kind of put this in context, this is the last produced film of what is not consistently called either the Dollars trilogy, the Man with No Name trilogy, whatever. This set of movies has a lot of different names. But it consists of A Fistful of Dollars, which we talked about before in relationship to Yojimbo. So go find that episode, shameless plug, for a few dollars more, and then The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And they are kind of a trilogy in that Clint Eastwood plays practically the same kind of a character. Lee Van Cleef is in For a Few Dollars More. Sergio Leone made them all. They all have the same tone, but they're not direct. They're not a direct continual story or even anthology, because Lee Van Cleef's character in For a Few Dollars More is very different from Angel Eyes. Also, The Good, the Bad, the Ugly is set before all the others, although there's a fun little bit where before the last scene, the showdown scene, Clint Eastwood picks up a poncho, which is the same poncho that he wears in the other two films. So it's kind of like an origin story of sorts. But again, there's no direct tie between the three films. But they are three really great, still extremely well-regarded Western films, and they all have that little tie, so it's fun to put them all together, kind of like the Cornetto trilogy, where they're all kind of like thematically and stylistically similar, but they're not, a direct trilogy.
Yeah, and this is kind of the beginning of a style of B movie that I personally refer to as pulpy. I don't know if that's 100% accurate, but it is what the reason I call it that is because it's the kind of B-movie film from the 60s and 70s that influences Tarantino, and we're about to see that because we're about to talk about a Tarantino film to a large amount, and Tarantino made Pulp Fiction, so whenever I think of pulpy movies, I think about the stuff that inspired Quentin Tarantino, which is zoom heavy, action heavy, technicolor gore fests from the 60s and 70s, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly definitely falls into that category. So when talking about that kind of genre movie of sorts and calling it pulpy, I typically mean dramatic action. It's very genre heavy. It doesn't try to deconstruct the genre completely. Like, it's not like a meta commentary so much as it kind of spins into the genre and embraces it and hits all of the notes that you were hoping the genre to hit. It's typically in Technicolor. Typically there's a lot of action or a lot of romance, one of the two. It's very, very fun to watch. It's like story candy for your brain that you just really enjoy watching. And again, all of this pulpy B-movie genre movie from the 60s and 70s, that category influences films like Django Unchained, which we're about to talk about. And also Edgar Wright. He's a very big fan of this era as well.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the story of Westerns, is this undulation between B-movie and something a little higher than B-movie, because I think before Stagecoach, it kind of was that kind of B-movie thing that, you know, some people went to see, but Stagecoach kind of elevated it to more of a respected drama. And I think it's similar. I think it had kind of slumped back into just kind of this shoot 'em up with no real, you know, external value as perceived by most people. And then something like The Good, the Bad, the Ugly comes along, which, you're right, does use a lot of those same tropes and stuff like that, but in a way is kind of taking a look at, like we said, that romanticized version of the West that is very kind of it's almost this this enviable kind of setting where you're like, oh, that would be so cool to be in that environment. And then Sergio Leone comes along and shows how like dark and gritty that world really would have been, and how it's not something to kind of look up to. I mean, it is very fun to watch The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, but it's also a lot harder to watch than Stagecoach, as you know, as you can see just from the first couple scenes with Bad, where he starts off shooting a rancher and his family, and then goes and shoots an old man in the face through a pillow. Like, Sergio Leone is telling you that this is not your family fun John Wayne film. And so, yeah, it's a reflection back on that early Hollywood, but also creating a new wave of films in a different vein. And then Tarantino comes along and he grabs both of them by the reins and just runs with it in Django Unchained. All right, so Django Unchained is the story of a German bounty hunter played by Christoph Waltz, who at the beginning of the film comes along and is looking for a specific slave. This is set in just before the Civil War, deep South. I think Tarantino at one point actually described this as a Southern rather than a Western, because it is kind of a journey through the South and through slavery as this big backdrop, almost in the same way that the Civil War was a backdrop to The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. So Christoph Waltz's character, Dr. Schultz, is looking for a specific slave named Django, who used to be owned by these specific people that Schultz is looking for because he has a bounty for them, but he doesn't know what they look like. So somehow, it doesn't matter, he finds out that Django can help him. So he buys Django and kills his owners, because this is a very violent film. This is Tarantino. That's pretty much implied.
It's even more violent than the pulp films that influenced him.
Oh, yeah. It's incredibly violent. So after he has bought Django, Django helps him find the three brothers that he's looking for and kill them, and then decides to... The interesting dynamic here is the fact that Christoph Waltz plays a German, so he comes from a different culture where and basically he describes to Django the fact that he does not approve of slavery, but he can't change the system, and as long as it can benefit him, he will use it. So he comes out very straightforwardly with that. But he gives Django his freedom after he helps him find these brothers, but then feels this kind of responsibility towards him, since, as he says, he's never given anyone their freedom before, and decides to kind of not really train Django, because there's really no point in which Django is not good at shooting people. But he lets Django come along and take a third of his bounties for winter, and then they're going to go and find Django's wife and free her. So it turns out that she has been bought by a Mr. Calvin Candy, played by Leonardo DiCaprio.
Oscar-winning actor.
Oscar-winning actor Leonardo DiCaprio. Not for this film. that would have been a very controversial decision.
Oh, and the one he won for wasn't a controversial decision?
Well, that's true. Probably not as controversial, though. So, yeah, Leonardo DiCaprio plays Mr. Calvin Candy, who is obviously a slave owner of a large plantation, but he also trades in Mandingo fighters. And what that is, which I didn't, and I'm sure a lot of people did not know what it was before this film, is basically having...
Warning. Fucked up warning.
Yeah. I apparently in the old Deep South, it was a thing to have two of your slaves, or your slave and someone else's slave, basically just fight to the death. Just bare bones, bare knuckle.
Yeah, it's like dog fights, but with humans.
With people, yeah.
Yeah, deeply, deeply messed up.
Yeah, thankfully they only show, I mean, not that it was really necessary to show any of them, but there's only one actual Mandingo fight just to introduce us to the concept. Again, this is a very violent film, not only with guns. So
yeah, let's say not a romanticized version of the South.
Of anything, yeah.
Well, for anybody who's not a terrible piece of trash.
Right. So basically they decide that they want to buy Django's wife, Broomhilda, Hildy for short, from Calvin Candy, but it is probably not the best idea just to waltz in and say, hey, I want to buy your one slave just totally randomly. So they decide to propose a ridiculous offer on a Mandingo fighter and then hope to kind of throw Broomhilda in with this really large deal. And again, this is really like terrible, but slavery is the backdrop for this whole thing. And it eventually Calvin Candy finds out about their deal through Samuel L. Jackson's worst character ever. And yeah, everything goes south. Everything blows up, and Django has to come in and save the day. And that is your your general overview. But this is also a 2-hour and 45-minute film, and it is a very long journey. Again, through the South this time, and through it's again fairly episodic. Through these different instances of running into different slave traders, and then trying to get away with things and getting caught and going back, and there's a lot of back and forth.
The way they travel through the seasons and have to take a break almost for winter reminds me a lot of John Ford's The Searchers. Yes, so as you can see, this is a film that much like a lot of Quentin Tarantino's work, it's very referential. It pulls a lot of inspiration and almost direct references from work that came before it. In large part, films like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and more directly from the original Django film from the 60s.
The original guy who played Django makes a cameo in the film.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he's the guy at the counter after the Mandingo fight, and he says, "How do you spell that?" And Jamie Foxx says, "The D is silent." And he's like, "I know." That's the little wink and nod there.
I didn't know that. That's clever. So yes, of course, this pulls from the pulp movies, but of course it also pulls from the older golden age of Hollywood and the golden age of Westerns. I mean, it's impossible to call some of those shots that were in that movie, especially of the landscapes, anything other than John Ford shots, especially when they take their detour into the far west and go up to, I believe, Colorado or somewhere really cold for the winter. It feels very, very John Ford-esque. I mean, even directors who were contemporary to John Ford called shots like that John Ford shots because he was so dang good at them.
I think we talked about with Howard Hawks how when Howard Hawks went to make a Western, he was talking with Bogdanovich about it, and they were like, he asked for a shot to be done like John Ford, and Bogdanovich was like, wait, are you just like copying John Ford? And he's like, okay, if you're gonna make a Western, you have to copy John Ford. There's no way else to do it because he just did it the best.
Yeah, and even and you know what? At this point, and even at the point of like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, definitely at the point of, and even at the point of, and especially at the point of Django and anything moving forward, it's impossible to make anything that doesn't reference John Ford, even if you try not to, even if you try to reference anything else, because everything references John Ford. Like at this point, if you reference any other movie in the Western genre, you're referencing John Ford, whether you know it or not. Like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly pulls from it. All of the pulpy Westerns pull from it. And everything nowadays that is more directly pulling from the pulpy Westerns, and I say Django is more directly inspired by those, is pulling by like this weird transitive property from the work of John Ford.
Yeah. But that's kind of what Tarantino has built his career on, and he's really good at, as we've also talked about before, the more wide your references are, the more original your film feels, and that's why Tarantino is just so well watched that he can pull so many different references from so many different things and put his own personal flavor on it that it feels like something completely new, and it feels really fresh, and that's what Django is. It's a very new kind of a story, and you know what? It also it almost references Blazing Saddles, like we talked about with the last episode. There's a little bit kind of the fact that you have two a white and a black protagonist, kind of a two-hander, going through the South and kind of upsetting social conventions. It's almost a implied reference to Blazing Saddles, and almost the scene whenever they come into that first town and everyone just kind of stops and is looking at them is almost the same way as when Cleavon Little comes into the town and they're expecting their new sheriff. But this film is kind of a satire on that. Every situation they go into, they're just upsetting social customs and making people super uncomfortable and super nervous. But it's in the same way as Blazing Saddles, but with a much more grounded and darker tone. It's like, what if that actually happened? What would people's reactions be? And then, what if this guy was actually killing white people? What would people's reactions be? And that's why we get a KKK ambush in this film, which is actually, ironically, one of the funniest scenes in the film is the KKK scene, which I don't know if that's just Tarantino's twisted sense of humor to put those two things together, but yeah, it's ridiculous.
It's hard not to laugh at. So
yeah, and then just Tarantino just kind of makes you. The whole premise is that after they've gone to this first plantation and killed the brothers they were looking for initially, all the people of the plantation and surrounding areas all kind of converge on them and try to ambush Dr. Schultz and Django at night with these white bags over their face, but none of them can see out of the holes in their masks, and so they're just like this big mess.
And they're all complaining at this one guy who I believe is played by Josh. Isn't that Josh Gad?
No, well, Jonah Hill is in there, and then they talk to someone else, and they're like, Your wife couldn't have done these better. And he's like, well, if you don't like it, don't ask us for anything. Yeah.
No, the way that Tarantino treats the South almost feels like he's making light of. It can at times feel like he's almost making light of the situation in a scene like that. But really, I feel like it's more of mocking the ridiculousness of the setup. Like, really, a bunch of grown men got together and organized and put bags over their heads to be racist terrorist assholes. Like, really?
But yeah, that's actually what happened. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's not only is it awful and bad, and we all know that, it's also ridiculous. And sometimes laughter can be more threatening to to something like that than disgust can be.
And in some ways more therapeutic.
Yeah, and definitely more therapeutic. Sometimes you don't need all of the seriousness, because there's plenty of really dramatic moments in this movie. They don't necessarily need more drama. The humor was definitely welcome.
Yeah. And it's not to say that this film is without controversy. I mean, obviously, all these things go into a film like this, and Tarantino is just a controversial director in general.
I mean, with all of his movies, how many times has he dropped the N-bomb?
Yeah, and so the setting for this basically just gave him license, and the N-word is used so much. I mean, we talked about how much it was used in Blazing Saddles, but it's very prevalent here, and so that can definitely turn people off to the film. But the rest of the film is just done with so much style, and it's amazing how he can mix levity and just this really dark, gory violence into this really stylized mix that doesn't feel like it doesn't fit.
Right. All right. So with that, let's transition into overall notes for the day. And before we talk about anything else with overall notes, we should talk about the thing with the widest scope when it comes to the Western genre, and that is the Western genre's place in America's view of itself, because it is kind of like a quintessentially American genre. Like we've talked before about the Manchurian Western. We've talked before about a curry Western. We've talked about how it's adapted to other genres, and those are interesting versions of it. But everything about a Western is quintessentially American. Like, the setting doesn't just mean the Western Hemisphere; it means the West of America, the country, and all of the ideals that go into it: heroicism, the time period, heroicism. Virtue, independent, strong-minded, even kind of a sense of taking responsibility or into your own hands in this borderline or sometimes outright vigilante way, where you circumvent more formal forms of government, because America, I mean, heck, it was born out of the country was born out of an anti-government revolution. It's part of the DNA of America to be a little anti-government, if not a lot of anti-government. And all of those ideals are wrapped up in a Western. And if we track the Western over the decades, we see how America's changing view of itself reflected in how Westerns are made, whether it be during the 30s when America's in depression and you need escapism, and it's a fantasy idealized world of when a man could work or a woman could work, and there's all these ideals, and who's the good guy, who's the bad guy. America is never smack talked. In the 40s and the 50s, you have this very strong, you can kind of tie the 30s in with this, but you have this very strong sense of America being on top of the world, and almost this kind of propaganda buildup of the Western genre, where A, it's really popular, and B, as a quintessential part of the American mythology, it becomes idealized, and you get all these Westerns that essentially feel like American myths and fables of how great America is. Look how great it is with all these heroes living out in the West. And then moving into the 60s with Cultural Revolution and a certain amount of self-reflection, and you see people starting to deconstruct all of those ideas that were so popular in the 40s and the 50s, and you get stuff like Sergio Leone's work, where he's trying to show that all of this violence isn't a good thing, and maybe the West wasn't such a great place, and that idea continues until today. You don't see nearly as many Westerns being made. There's a few. We've talked about No Country for Old Men before, which I would consider a Western. And even that is kind of about the death of the Western. Right. And you have stuff like Django, which is a deliberate callback to older Westerns, but got
the new 310 to Yuma. I mean, there's little ones that pop up here and there, and then there's
a floundering genre.
Yeah. Lesser ones that you think of, like Lawless and the new Magnificent Seven that just kind of pass away. There's not very many that stick in the cultural imagination nowadays.
Yeah, and if the Western is like an idealized mythology of America or America's past, does that idealized mythology still have a place in in the cultural stories we tell about ourselves? Not to get too term papery on you guys, but it kind of ties into this question: will the popularity of Westerns return? I mean, there tends to be an ebb and flow with all genres, but the Western's been gone for quite a long time in any sort of major way. And, maybe it'll make a comeback. Maybe it won't. And a lot of it probably depends on the course that our culture as a country and, in the wider sense of Western civilization, what path it takes over the next few decades to see whether or not we'll be inspired to tell Western tales that are more than just love letters to Westerns of the past.
Yeah. And I don't think Westerns will ever go away, but I think you're right. I think their prominence and predominance over the general scope of Hollywood filmmaking is probably maybe done for a very long time. There will be those that pop up now and then because it's such an influential genre. And I think it'll creep. I think the themes of Westerns creep into modern films, like you're saying with No Country for Old Men, which is very modern but has a lot of kind of Western influence in it. But I think it's also interesting just to look at the fact that the predominant genre of a culture is constantly changing. I feel like superheroes are today's Westerns. I don't think they're going to last forever, but they sure are going to make
at least calm down a bit.
They sure are going to make as many as they can in the next, however many years until something else comes along and proves more popular. But I think it's interesting. I don't know what that means about, the way that we look at things nowadays. But, in the way that Westerns kind of dominated the filmic scene at some points in time, I think superheroes are doing that now. It's not the only things that's being made. It's not the only good things that are being made. They're not all good, but there's just a huge kind of culture and push for these superhero films, and they're constantly just getting flooded at the box office as they come along. And there's a little bit of a difference, though. It's a little bit interesting the way that superhero movies are structured, and we don't have to go into this. Maybe we'll do a superhero episode, but the fact that most of the superhero movies are interconnected kind of makes people feel an obligation to go see each next one.
Makes it a little bit different, but like looking on the more cynical side of the marketing and the business aspect of making movies to make money, which technically all movies or most movies are made to make money on some level, and especially in the modern,
unless you're making
arena
Shein
of
on
movie
the
making. Yeah, true, and especially in the modern arena of movie making, where the studios don't make a lot of movies per year, and they're very careful with what they pick to make. They don't make B movies; they just make big budget A movies. And then they farm the other ones out to like branch mini studios, independent studios. But, Westerns aren't traditionally franchised. I can think of a couple of franchises that were of Westerns. And
even the Dollars trilogy, like we talked about, is probably the most famous quote unquote franchise that's not even really a trilogy.
Yeah. I mean, they kind of franchised the Magnificent Seven, but even that was just putting the same name on different movies. And today there is no big Western franchises that go on and on and on that a bunch of people are familiar with and will buy tickets for and buy merch for, and will write fan and art about. So studios aren't as interested in making it as they used to be.
Yeah, and the one thing I do want to bring up in light of that is Westworld. I think that is an interesting evolution of the Western genre into the realm of television.
Get out of my Western sci-fi. You have your own genre.
Yeah, it's some genre bending, genre mixing. It actually comes from a film from, I believe, the 70s or 80s. That's practically a Western. But yeah, so that's probably the most culturally prevalent iteration of Western, and it's got so much sci-fi in it that it's really hard to call it a Western anyway.
Yeah, so I don't know. I'm more of a Western guy than I am a sci-fi guy. Like, I like sci-fi, but I just don't ooh and ah over technology in sci-fis. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's because we grew up inundated with it that I just am not impressed by new technology, especially when I know it's all made up. I don't know. Anyway, this isn't the sci-fi episode. We already did that. Go listen to that. This is the Western episode. Woohoo! Shoot 'em up. Pew.
All right, so with all that being said, going back to reference something that we said very near the beginning of this episode, Alex, kick us off for what we're talking about next time. Another very long overdue episode.
Right, they're all long overdue. Anyway, next week we will be talking about Orson Welles, because he's Orson Welles, and who hasn't heard of Orson Welles?
He's the Orson Welles of directors.
Right, that's a saying. And next week we're going to talk about why. The first up, we're going to talk about the Wunder Kid, when he was actually a kid, making Citizen Kane in 1941. Then we're going to talk about Chimes at Midnight from 1965, which I currently know nothing about and is going to be fascinating to talk about. And then finally, we're going to talk about one of the weirdest movies I've ever seen, but also one of the curiously good ones that I can't quite explain why it's so good. It's just good. F for Fake from 1973, which is kind of an Orson Welles retrospective on all of the fakery and sleight of hand that goes into movie making and all sorts of art, really. But yes, it should be fascinating to talk about.
Yeah, Orson Welles is a giant in the realms of film, theater, and radio, and so many mediums. He kind of did a little bit of everything and left a big mark on pretty much everything. So I'm very excited. Hopefully we can cram it all into one episode. But it should be really, really good to talk about.
Mm-hmm. And that's about all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I could be found on Twitter at @JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Garinger.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya.
And then he died.
Right.